Hello and welcome back to Leeds Student Television. Recently, the UK overwhelmingly voted for change and elected a new Labour government and therefore new Prime Minister. That same week, Alex Stanley also started a new leadership role as the National Union of Students Vice President for Higher Education. To discuss the election results and more, I am pleased to say he joins us on LSTV now. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a really exciting time in student politics and politics more widely, as you say. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak to you.
Just going back to the week of July 4th, which was a couple of weeks ago now, not only stepping into this role from a student union officer role, but to a student political role on a national level, probably one of the highest roles in that regard. But also at the same time, as such a historic general election with a big change over there in the just general politics. How was that?
Well, look, this has been a really difficult 14 years for students. We've seen students having to choose between heating and eating. There's double the food bank usage there has been since 2022. 55% of students are actively cutting back on the amount of food that they're having at university. So what we're seeing is a true cost of living crisis, and we need to see government tackling that. So I think a lot of students will be welcoming that idea of change. But at the same time, that really needs to mean something for students. And there's been a slight concern around the lack of mentioning of universities and the sector more widely, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of exciting work going on, particularly around some of the things like the Renters Reform Bill. So a lot of positive work that we can look towards, but that doesn't mean that we won't be holding the government to account where they aren't doing enough for students.
So as you say, there is quite a lot of positive change that could come out of a new government for students, but also some parts that may not go far enough. What would your big asks as NUS to the government for students?
So in our first 100 days, we'll be focusing on tackling some of those big issues that were brought up in the Labour Party's winning manifesto. So one of those, as I said, would be the Renters Reform Bill. It's really, really important that student renters are held to the same, given the same support as the wider renters in the UK. And that's why we'll be pushing for that student exemption that the Tories put forward to be scrapped. And it's looking like that is a real possibility. Another thing that we'd like to see is the space for guarantors to be removed. I think particularly for international students, that's been a really, really difficult issue that we've seen come up time and time again. And I definitely saw come up in my time at Exeter. So we'll be doing a lot of work around housing, as it's been a really challenging issue for a lot of students home and international. Another thing that came up in the Labour Party's manifesto was votes at 16. Unfortunately, we didn't see that in the King's Speech, but that doesn't mean we won't continue to push. The same goes for things like automatic enrolment when it comes to registration for voting for students, and also making sure that things like student ID are accepted at the ballot box. So there's a lot of work that can be done and will be done. I'd say the same about things like Skills England when we look at further education. And I know our new Vice President for Further Education, Cassim, will be doing a lot of work there. But in the short term, it's going to be making sure some of those big promises that the Labour Party made are kept. And then we can start to have further discussions about the big issues challenging students, like ending that hostile environment that international students are facing and pushing for a review of the funding model in higher education.
And as you say, some of this was in the King's Speech, some of it wasn't. How optimistic are you that things that weren't mentioned in the King's Speech, and some stuff that was, because not always have we seen in politics that things that are mentioned, we see it come through fruition. So how confident are you in these changes happening?
Well, look, when it comes to things that were in the King's Speech, we're confident but not complacent. I think that's exactly why our focus in the first 100 days is getting some of those bigger projects over the line. I mean, some of this work has taken years. It's been years in the making. So things like the Renters Reform Bill and pushing to get rid of that student exemption, this isn't something that just happened overnight. And we're absolutely clear that we'll continue to push until we see the paper signed on the dotted line. But on some of those wider conversations and things that weren't directly mentioned in the King's Speech. So take funding, for instance. The Labour Party's manifesto clearly states that the funding model for higher education isn't fit for purpose. And there's a real range within the sector of what that could actually mean. So University UK's manifesto says that tuition fees should be tied to inflation. We, of course, disagree with that, but it's so important that what we do as the student movement is take control of that narrative and say that the student experience and putting money back into students' pockets is our number one priority, and that has to take precedent in these conversations.
Thank you very much for that. Moving on to more the wider campus situation that we've seen over the past year. It's going into the new academic year. We've seen tensions on campus in the aftermath of the Israel-Hamas war, an ongoing war, increased tensions between communities on campus. We've seen a massive record-breaking rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus. What work can NUS be doing, working with student unions and universities and the government more widely to ensure that going to university is a safe space for every student?
Well, look, this is a devastating situation, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to see the scenes that we are. And I cannot imagine how awful a time this must be for people that do have those connections, be it family or friends, to people in the region. And I know that a lot of students find themselves in that situation. As you say, we've seen encampments on a number of universities directly relating to solidarity with Palestine in a lot of situations. And what I'd say to student unions is that it's really, really important that we're uplifting student voice and protecting the right to protest. But that can never come at the expense of protecting students against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I do think that there is a space for both of those conversations to be had at the same time. And it's really, really important that student unions are protecting the right to free speech and pushing back where universities are challenging that, potentially with some pressure from regulatory bodies. But at the same time, at NUS, we know what a difficult time it's been for Jewish and Muslim students. We've had our own challenges when it comes to both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And on anti-Semitism, we're absolutely clear that the recommendations of the Tuck report will be carried out in full, and that comes through our anti-Semitism action plan. And equally, we'll be doing a lot of work with Muslim students and Muslim sabbatical officers to ensure that this is a safe space where we can have those challenging and uncomfortable conversations, because that's really, really important, but do so in a way that's respectful and understand some of the real human empathy in this situation. You know, this is a really, really challenging conversation for a lot of people to have, but it needs to be done in a respectful way.
And you'll be aware that the NUS are working on the action plan and everything that's coming from that. But at the recent conference, there was quite a few incidents which hit national press. The Union of Jewish Students said that it's time to accept the NUS conference is broken beyond repair. Have there been any conversations in your first few weeks about how NUS conference will look more widely in the future?
Well, look, as you say, we're only a couple of weeks into the role, and our focus primarily has been on our induction, but we have had some real conversations about both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more to come from us in the upcoming months on what conference will look like and how we're ensuring that it's a safe space for all students, and that includes Jewish and Muslim students.
Moving more locally, Leeds University Union recently in May held a referendum on their affiliation and membership of the NUS. It didn't reach quorum, so LU will be staying members of NUS, but there was still a lot of support for the disaffiliation. What can NUS do to rebuild trust with both SUs and students to ensure that there is not much of this questioning over this disaffiliation in the years to come?
Well, look, first of all, I'll say that I'm very glad to hear that Leeds will be staying as a member of the NUS. And what I'd say is that, particularly with a government that could be more receptive to our voices, it's so important that that voice is one that's united, even through a difficult few years, both with Tory government and our own internal challenges. We've made some real progress on a number of issues. We've seen huge support packages in the devolved regions when it comes devolved nations when it comes to finances. We fought against the Tory plans to scrap the graduate route. And looking forward, we've got some big plans too. As I said, for the first 100 days, we want to make sure that the Renters Reform Bill goes through in a way that works for students. We want to be supporting international students in fighting against the hostile environment. We want to be pushing for a funding model that's sustainable for students, staff, and universities. And it's so, so important that we have a united voice in pushing for that. Because as I said, the sector isn't united on all of those issues. Universities are going to prioritise the sustainable funding of universities. And I completely understand and support the rationale of that. But that can't come at the expense of the student experience, and it can't come at the expense of putting money back into students' pockets at a time where the average student is living off of 50p per week once they've paid their rent. So it's a message that needs to be united, and that means that unions like Leeds should absolutely be staying put in the NUS in what should be a really exciting next few years.
And moving into that, moving into your role, can you just explain briefly about what your role is within that as the Vice President of Higher Education?
Absolutely. So my primary focus will be on what goes on at universities. We do also have a vice president for further education. We have a UK president who focuses on both, and a vice president for liberation and equality. So when it comes to representatives in England, those are the primary representatives. So I'll be doing a lot of work with universities, and then, as I said, one of those big priorities will be on the funding model. So if there are any students out there in Leeds who do want to get involved, do drop me an email or drop me a line. And I'm sure there's a lot of exciting work that we can do on a variety of topics, whether it's rent, support for international students, the funding model. I'm really hoping that with a new government, we'll see the prospects of change in our sector, but we can only do that as a united movement. And I think it's really important that unions like Leeds are getting as involved as possible. You're one of the biggest and best student unions in the country, and I think you'll have a really important role to play in making positive change for students.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today and for giving us all that insight into what is an exciting time in both NUS and wider in the wider student movement as well. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.